Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be replacing the rear wheel on my Ride1Up Revv1. It was bent. It seemed like it was bent from the factory from shipping. I had a serious wobble in it, as you can see. It was very noticeable. So we're going to go ahead and replace that today. Here's the new wheel that Ride1Up sent me for free under warranty. All right, first things first, we're going to lay down a towel or a blanket to make sure we don't mar up our controls or our handlebars or anything like that. We're going to flip the bike over. I find it easier to grab it by the rear triangle and the front fork and just kind of muscle it over. If you got a different method and you're not going to blow your back out like I normally do, then feel free to do that. This just works for me until the next day when I have to recover. First thing we're going to do is remove the 8T25 Torx bolts to hold the control plate. The control plate is on the bottom of the bike there, in case you weren't aware. That's where the controller is hidden, where all the cabling is hidden. What we're doing is we're getting access to the motor wire because we need to disconnect it to remove the rear wheel. So once we get that plate off, we just want to investigate that cavity and see what we're working with in there. It's pretty tight in there. There's a little hole in the bottom of the frame where the motor wire, the cadence sensor, and I believe the brake light wire all feed through. So we want to make sure we clip the zip ties for those. And then we need to go ahead and feed this cable through this little compartment in the bottom of the frame. When you're undoing the motor cable, you just basically unscrew it counterclockwise and then you pull it apart. Make sure you're pulling it straight apart and not pulling it apart down or yanking it by the ends. While you have the controller plate off, it might be a good idea as well to take a picture of things inside there before you start messing with it so that you can reference how to put it all back together. I found it easiest to remove the motor wire by pushing that black cable all the way over to the left, holding it with my thumb, and then pulling the motor cable out of that hole. It took a minute, but once we got it out, we were in good shape. Also pay attention to how this is routed. The cable is routed around the foot peg and behind the kickstand and exits out the back of the bike. So the next step is we're going to remove the tensioner. It has a 6mm hex bolt that is softer than chocolate. I believe I stripped mine in the process. It just didn't seem deep enough to get the hex wrench all the way in there. I would get a little bit of a bite on it, start applying some pressure, and then it would slip out, mar up the finish on the bolt, spin. I'd put the hex back in there, was able to get some spins out of it, and then it would soften up again and give me a little bit of an issue. So I think it's a cheap bolt that they used. I'm going to have to replace it with something a little more heavy duty from the hardware store. This tensioner system definitely gave me a run for my money while putting the bike back together, as you'll see later. So when we release the tension, we're just pushing that pulley forward. Once we have the tension loose, we can go ahead and loosen up our 19mm axle nuts now. There's some tabbed washers in there as well, and we just want to make sure once we get the axle nuts loose that we fish those tabbed washers away from the hub as they kind of get sucked in there. and I just grabbed the flathead and just kind of pushed them away from the hub the best I could, because they're pretty hard to grab with your fingers. So something like a flathead will work. And you can see there I've got the tab washer separated now from the hub and sitting on the outside of the frame. Bad angle here, but it's the same thing on that side. Once you get to that step, you're ready to go ahead and start pulling the wheel out of the dropouts. If you lift the wheel up to a decent height, it'll release all the tension on the chain and you can just slide it right off the freewheel. And that's it. That's how you get the wheel out. Now that we get the wheel out, we got to swap over the old rotor to the new wheel. This is a T25 Torx bit. Just unscrew all those bolts. Highly recommend to wear gloves while you're handling your rotor. Once you get the rotor out, we're going to go ahead and remove the freewheel with the Park FR1-3 freewheel removal tool. This tool saved my bacon. Excellent tool. Would highly recommend. I don't think you should buy any other brands but this brand, as I've read a lot of reviews and some of the cheaper made tools that do exactly what this tool do either ended up breaking people's freewheels or causing them a lot more grief than what it was worth. The directions say to use the axle nut on the top and then use that as your leverage point. I found this to be pretty difficult, so I struggled with it trying to get it loose, and I couldn't. This was super tight on there. Once I released the axle nut off the top, I was able to get more leverage on the actual tool itself, and we were able to get the freewheel off. I highly recommend you use something like a step or a curb to keep the wheel in place and also give yourself a little bit more of a leverage point. So the next thing to do is swap over the old wheel and the old tube to the new wheel. Sorry, swap over the old tire and the old tube to the new wheel. For this, I'm just using tire levers, just removing the wheel, just like you would any other tire. I filmed this part of it. It was a little bit of a struggle to get it off, but we managed to do so. The biggest pain was putting it back on the new wheel. It just wouldn't seat properly. I had to go ahead and do the soapy water trick where you spray the entire tire down with some soapy water and then keep pumping it up until it sucks into place. Sometimes you might overinflate when you're doing that, so just be careful. If you do, remember to go ahead and release some pressure before you put it back on the bike. All right, so this is the new wheel. This is how it comes from Ride1Up. It's very nice of them to include all new hardware for the wheel. So you have new axle nuts, and the bolts they included, I believe, were for the rotor. I just ended up using the old rotor bolts. I don't think it makes too big of a difference. I do plan on changing out that rotor and brake system probably within the next couple months, maybe during the winter. So I didn't Loctite the rotor, the bolts. I didn't Loctite the rotor bolts on there, but you can if you want to. Here I'm just showing the alignment of those tabbed washers. There's a square cutout in them, and the frame is also, the axle, sorry, is also square. So you have to make sure they're lined up correctly when you get them in the bike, and I'm just showing you how to do that right here. And then here we're just putting the free wheel back on to the new wheel. Just screw it in so it's hand tight, and then if you need to use the tool to crank it down and really get it locked in there, feel free. Again, there's those tabbed washers with the square cut out on them. So I kind of did this step backwards where I put the new rotor on the wheel before I had the tire on there. And then once I got it on there, I realized, and I was like, I should probably take this off and then put the tire on because one, I don't want to cut myself on the rotor. Two, I don't want to bend the rotor. Three, it's just easier to manipulate the rim and the tire without the rotor getting in the way. So highly recommend you put your tire on first before you put the rotor back on. Learn from my mistakes. When I put the rotor on, I'm just basically doing it in a star pattern. So putting one bolt in, moving to the every other bolt, snugging those up, and then going back and tightening them down again. Again, all in the star pattern. You definitely want to wear gloves when you're handling the rotor. You don't want to get any of your skin oils or anything like that on the rotor itself. Any grease that you might encounter, anything like that is really going to mess up your brakes. So we're just finishing putting the rotor back on here. Again, using a T25 Torx bit. And just cranking them down now that they're all on. I'm definitely looking to upgrade to a bigger rotor. Like I said earlier, I just don't think this bike has enough stopping power for the speeds that it can do. All right, next we are going to go ahead and put the wheel back into the frame. Put the chain on there first. And remember that if the motor cable is in the back of the wheel, that your axle should be aligned properly. It might take a little bit of work just to get it in there perfectly, but it wasn't too difficult. I did have to kind of shift some things around a little bit. You also want to make sure when you're doing this that the tabbed washers end up on the outside of the frame and they don't go on the inside of the frame. So in other words, don't put those washers on the axle before you put the wheel into the dropouts. Otherwise, you'll never get it in there. Just basically want to get it all set up into the dropouts and then put those tab washers on the outside. They have to be on the outside of the frame. There is a washer that goes on the inside of the frame, just like a little ring washer. So again, here's those tab washers. We're putting them on, lining up those squares with the axle itself. and making sure they're on the outside of the frame. And here I'm showing you that that is how it is. They're just set up right there on the outside of the frame. Now we can go ahead and get our 19 millimeter axle nuts and we can put those back on. Crank those down and get them nice and snug. And then we can move to the tensioner system once we get those axle nuts back on. The tensioner system was the bane of my existence on this rebuild. Again, I had stripped that 6 millimeter hex nut, so it is what it is. We'll get there. Anyway, per that last picture, just go ahead and reroute your motor cable the way that it was originally. Make sure you get your zip ties back in there. Feed that cable back through the cavity, plug it in, check your power, make sure everything's good before you button it back up. As you can see, I still got the controller plate off down there, but giving it a test whirl, and I'm happy to say that it does not appear that there's any wobble in that wheel. A little bounce, but that's because it's on the kickstand. But other than that, that's going to do it. We are back together and back on the road. If you have any questions, let me know. I'd be happy to help you out. This was fairly easy to do, so shouldn't be too big of a pain if anyone has to go through it as well. Like I said, I'd be happy to give you some tips.